Let's start with segment 2 of this module, which is Gram Swaraj as a lived practice, lived reality, and not simply a policy. So you see, now that we understand why villages did not collapse after independence, the next step is to understand how villages actually govern themselves, on a day-to-day basis. When we use the term Gram Swaraj, it's easy to think of it as an idea proposed by Gandhi or something formalized through Panchayati Raj systems in the 1990s. But that framing can be somewhat misleading. Gram Swaraj did not begin as a policy. In fact, it existed as a practice long, long before it was ever written into the law. Let's take the example of Gram Sabhas, for instance. A Gram Sabha is often described in a variety of literature, textbook, as a formal assembly of village residents. But if you look at this Gram Sabha closely functioning historically, we realize that the idea was always there. Across villages, many decisions were taken collectively. These included decisions about land use, water sharing, dispute resolution, community work. In fact, mentions of Gram Sabha and Gram Samitis have predated British by several hundred, more than 1,000 years. In fact, we find many of these references mentioned in Mahajanapada period, during the periods of later Vedic age, even during the time period of Maurya. And so therefore, villages or Indian rural or Indian hinterlands have always had collective decision making as part of their living DNA. For instance, even today in villages, for instance in present-day Maharashtra, long before the 73rd, 74th Amendment, community meetings were held where villagers discussed disputes related to common resources. These were not informal chats. They followed a recognized process. The elders spoke first, both sides were heard. The aim was not to punish, but to arrive at a solution that the village could live with. And what does this show? It shows that decision-making authority existed at the village level, not just at the level of kings or administrators or leaders or rulers. Try looking at this from a different context. During the COVID pandemic, many rural areas in India were able to manage their food security better than the cities. And this was not accidental. Villages in Andhra and Telangana, for instance, local farming practices ensured that basic food production continued even during the lockdown. People relied on locally grown rice, pulses, vegetables. Supply chain did not break completely because the village economy was not entirely dependent on some distant market, and the supply chain was therefore far more diverse. Equally important was the community response. Families shared resources, labor was coordinated informally, vulnerable households were supported not just from the state relief but through local cooperation. This is a modern example, but it reflects on an older principle. Village functions as collective unit, not just as clusters of individual, and therefore we need to consider these historical. Therefore, we need to consider the thinking about this at many levels, not just in present but also through history. In fact, texts like Arthashastra, they describe governance not as something imposed from above, but as something that emerges from local units. Villages there are described as foundational administrative and economic units. The state is expected to support them, not replace them. I mean, this is a thinking that has been percolated for more than 2,000 years. Even earlier, during Mahajanapadas, as I was mentioning, we see Shakya Ganasangha, where assemblies and councils played a crucial role in governance. These are not monarchies in the strict sense. Decision-making was involving discussion, agreement, participation. What's important here is not to romanticize the past also, but to recognize a pattern. Across time periods, villages in India, they developed ways to manage their own resources, methods to resolve their conflicts internally, and systems of accountability that was based on social trust. And that is why the introduction of Panchayati Raj in 1992, the 73rd, 74th Amendment, did not feel really alien. It actually formalized something that already existed. So when we say that Gram Swaraj is part of India's DNA, it is an observation based on how villages have actually functioned over centuries. Gram Swaraj is about villages having their agency, the ability to take decisions that affect everyday life. And this agency explains why villages could absorb change at national level without losing the internal stability. In the next segment, we will examine one crucial part of the system more closely, which is how villages handle justice, dispute, and authority, and why these systems were more often effective than distant quote-unquote formal institutions. Namaste.